The Farmers' Revolt. Hard times in the 1880s created a groundswell of agrarian revolt. Farmers in all regions of the country saw themselves as victims of the gold standard and the protective tariff that worked to the advantage of big business. Across the United States, angry farmers began to come together and protest and create new political alliances. Farmers had fallen on hard times. Prices kept falling decade after decade. Wheat that sold for $1 in 1870 dropped to 60 cents a bushel by the 1890s. Cotton plummeted from 15 cents to 5 cents a pound. Corn from 45 cents a bushel to 30 cents a bushel. At the same time, consumer prices soared, leaving farmers' income less than their expenditures. By 1894, half of Kansas's farms fell back to the banks as farmers couldn't afford to pay their mortgage. In the West, farmers fought the railroads, charging exorbitant rates for short hauls. This meant that a large grain elevator company could ship from Chicago to New York far less than what it cost a Dakota farmer to send his crop to nearby Minneapolis. In the South, they fought the crop lien system. In order to pay for seed and supplies, farmers pledged their crops to local creditors. At the heart of the problem stood a banking system committed by Eastern commercial banks to the gold standard, a railroad system with unfair rate practices, and rampant land speculation. Farm protest was not new. In the 1870s, farmers supported the Grange movement and backed the Greenback Party. And as the farmers' situation grew more desperate, the 1880s saw farmers organized into regional alliances. The Farmers' Alliance movement began with a small group of farmers gathered at a Lampasas County farm in Texas, and they banded together to fight the land sharks and horse thieves, as they called the Eastern elite. During the 1880s, this movement spread rapidly. In frontier farmhouses in Texas, to log cabins in the backwoods of Arkansas, to the rural parishes in Louisiana. These separate groups of farmers formed similar alliances for self-help. Now, as the movement grew, groups consolidated into two major regional alliances. You had the Northwestern Farmers Alliance, which was active in Kansas, Nebraska, and other Midwestern states, and then the more radical Southern Farmers Alliance, which got its start in Texas and spread through Georgia, Louisiana, and Arkansas. By 1890, the Southern Alliance counted more than 3 million members. Now, African Americans also formed their own alliance. It was the Colored Farmers Alliance. They were also founded in Texas in the 1880s. By 1891, the Southern Alliance claimed a membership of 1.2 million. Although the Colored Farmers Alliance did not always agree with the Southern White Alliance, but they came together for this common cause. At the heart of the alliance movement stood a series of co-ops. The farmers are getting together, banding together to sell their crops, and they're bulking is another term for it. Farmers could negotiate a better price by doing this. And by setting up trade stores and exchanges, they sought to escape the grasp of the creditor. Through the co-op, the Farmer Alliance promised to change the way farmers lived. We're going to get out of debt and be free and independent people once more, boasted a Georgia farmer. However, the co-op movement soon died. Farmers really were fighting against the merchant, the bankers, the wholesalers, and manufacturers, and they made it impossible for co-ops to get credit. So as this movement died, the Farmers Alliance will turn to politics. Texas farmers drafted a set of demands in 1886 and pressured politicians to endorse them. In 1890, the Southern Alliance basically called for railroad regulation, laws against land speculation, currency and credit reform. Confounded by the failure of the Democrats and Republicans to break with commercial interests and support the farmer, alliance leaders moved often reluctantly toward the formation of a third party. Now, in the early days of the alliance movement, the leadership strictly tried to keep this movement non-political and basically a secret business association. But by 1892, it was none of those things. Although some white Southern leaders made it clear that they would never threaten the unity of the white vote in the South by leaving the Democratic Party, advocates of the third party carried the day at the Convention of Laborers, Farmers, and Common Folk in St. Louis in 1892. There, the Farmers Alliance gave birth to the People's Party and launched the populist movement. The populists mounted a critique of the industrial society and call for action. Convinced that money and banking systems worked to the advantage of the wealthy few, they demanded economic democracy. To help farmers get credit, they needed reasonable rates. Southern farmers hit on the ingenious idea of a sub-treasury. This is a plan that would allow farmers to store their non-perishable crops in government storehouses until the market rose. At the same time, borrowing against crops, farmers could receive commodity credit from the federal government that enabled them to buy needed supplies and seed for the coming year. In the South, the sub-treasury system promised to eliminate the crop lien system for once and for all. But the Western farmer, the populists promised land reform, champion a plan that would reclaim excessive land grants granted to railroads or sold to foreign investors. The populists' boldest proposal called for government ownership of railroads and telegraph system to put an end to discriminatory rates. With the powerful railroads dominating politics and effectively nullifying the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, populists did not shrink from advocating what their opponents called state socialism. Currency was the third major focus of the populist movement. Farmers in all sections rallied for the cry for cheaper currency, endorsing the platform of free, unlimited coinage of silver. And this is an attempt to increase the nation's tight money supply and thus make credit easier to obtain. Because they shared this common cause with labor against corporate interests, populists supported the 8-hour workday and an end to contract labor. To empower the common people, the populist platform called for direct election of senators and electoral reforms, including the secret ballot and the right to initiate legislation, to recall elected officials, and submit issues to the people by means of a referendum. More than just a response to hard times, populism represented an alternative vision of American economic democracy. Now, as the Depression grew worse in 1893, we're going to see a group march on Washington, and they'll be dubbed Coxey's Army. Following the harsh dictates of social Darwinism and laissez-faire, the majority of America's elected officials believed it was inappropriate for the government to intervene, but the scope of the Depression made it impossible for local agencies to supply sufficient relief, and increasingly Americans called on the federal government to take action. Armies of the unemployed marched on Washington to demand relief, and the populist party experienced a surge in support as the election of 1896 draws closer at hand. Jacob Coxey of Ohio led the most publicized group. He's convinced that men could be put to work building badly needed roads for the nation. Coxey proposed a scheme to finance public works through non-interest bearing bonds. What I'm after, he maintained, is to try to put the country in a condition so that no man who wants to work remains idle. Starting out from Ohio with 100 men, the ranks soon swelled as they get to Washington. On May 1st, Coxey's army arrived in Washington. When Coxey defiantly marched his men on the Capitol grounds, the police set upon the demonstrators with nightsticks, cracking skulls, and arresting Coxey. Those who had trembled for the safety of the Republic heaved a heavy sigh of relief when Coxey's arrested, hoping that this would halt the march on Washington. Although the On to Washington movement proved ineffective in forcing federal relief legislation, Coxey's army dramatized the plight of the unemployed and acted, in the words of one participant, as a living, moving object lesson. Like the populists, Coxey's army called into question the underlying values of this new industrial order and demonstrated how ordinary citizens turned to means outside the regular party system to influence politics in the 1890s. Okay, the election of 1896 created a lot of fiery rhetoric, and many people saw the People's Party not a call for reform, but revolution. So throughout the country, the press denounced the populists as cranks, lunatics, and idiots. Now, in 1892, the populists had a candidate, and they did fairly well. They've got 1 million votes, which is pretty good for a new third party. But one of the problems is their nominee was ended up being a former Union general, and the South just couldn't bring themselves to vote for a populist candidate who was a Yankee, so they stayed away from the polls. Now, there was increasingly sectional and racial animosities that threatened party unity, but Tom Watson of Georgia is going to try to tackle the Negro problem and basically wipe out the color line and try to bring the white and black farmers together because they're both fighting the same economic problems. As the 1896 presidential election approached, the Depression intensified. Cries for reform not only came from populists but throughout the country. The Depression worsened the tight money problem caused by deflationary pressures of the gold standard. Once again, proponents of free silver, the unlimited coinage of silver, stirred rebellion in the ranks of both the Democrat and Republican parties. When the Republicans nominated William McKinley on the platform pledging to preserve the gold standard, Western advocates of free silver representing miners and farmers walked out of the convention. Open rebellion split also the Democratic Party because of Grover Cleveland's stance and his support for the gold standard. This kind of spirit animated the Democratic National Convention in 1896. The man of the hour, however, was William Jennings Bryan of Nebraska. The 36-year-old boy orator from the Platte whipped the convention into a frenzy with his passionate call for free silver. In his keynote address, Bryan masterfully cataloged the grievances of farmers and laborers, closing his dramatic speech with this famous line: "Do not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." Pandemonium broke loose as delegates stampeded to nominate Bryan. He will be the youngest candidate ever to run for the presidency. The juggernaut of free silver rolled out of Chicago on to St. Louis, where the People's Party met 1 week after the Democrats adjourned. Smelling victory, many Western populists urged the party to rally with the Democrats and fuse the two parties. However, this was a problem because of Bryan's running mate, Arthur Sewell. He represented everything the populace was opposed to. He was an Easterner, a banker, and a railroad director. So it was very hard to swing a lot of people to fuse these two parties together. But in the South, where Democrats had resorted to fraud and violence to steal elections from the populace in 1892 and 94, support for a Democratic ticket proved especially hard to swallow. Die-hard Southern populists wanted no part of fusion. All of these tactical differences emerged as populists met in St. Louis in 1896 to nominate a candidate for president. To show that they remained true to their principles, delegates first voted to support all the planks of the 1892 platform. In addition, add a call for public works projects for the unemployed, and narrowly defeated was a plank for women's suffrage. So to deal with the problem of fusion, the convention selected the vice presidential candidate first. The nomination of Tom Watson came about. He was the one that tried to fuse the Southern Alliance together with white and black farmers. But the populace didn't know it. Their cheers for Bryan signaled not a chorus of victory, but the death knell of the People's Party. Few contests in the nation's history has been so fiercely fought and with so much emotion as the election of 1896. On one side stood William McKinley, backed by the wealthy industrialists, and on the other side was William Jennings Bryan, with few assets beyond his silver tongue. He struggled to make up the energy and the eloquence what his party lacked in campaign funds. He set out on a new style of presidential campaigning, crisscrossing the country in a whirlwind tour, traveling more than 18,000 miles, delivering more than 600 speeches, and speaking to millions of Americans. As the election day approached, the Silver States and the Rocky Mountains lined up solidly for Bryan. The Northeast, however, stood for McKinley. Much of the South, with the exception of the border states, abandoned the populists and returned to the Democratic fold. The Midwest hung in balance. Bryan intensified his campaign in Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, hitting those swing states. But Midwestern farmers proved less receptive than Western voters to the idea of free silver. On Election Day, 4 out of every 5 voters went to the poll in an unprecedented turnout. In the critical Midwestern states, as many as 95 eligible voters cast their ballots. The election outcome hinged on a few key states, including Wisconsin, Iowa, and Minnesota. The votes were down to 100 to 1,000 votes in each state. Although McKinley won 23 states to Bryan's 22, the electoral vote showed a victory for McKinley, 271 to 176. The biggest losers in 1896, however, turned out to be the populists. In their clamor to support Bryan, populists in the South drifted back to the Democratic Party. The Populist Party was crushed, and with it died the agrarian revolt. But if populism proved unsuccessful at the polls, it nevertheless set the domestic political agenda for the United States in the next decades, highlighting issues such as banking and currency reform, electoral reforms, and an enlarged role for government in the economy.